The World Anti-Doping Agency has voted to reinstate Russia and Russia's anti-doping agency, RUSADA as it's known, lifting the ban that was imposed nearly 3 years ago after the doping scandal that rocked the sporting world. Chris Brown is live in Moscow to begin our coverage of this. What are we now hearing from WADA, Chris?
Just a couple of minutes ago, Heather, they released a statement from the president of WADA, Craig Reedy. I'll read a little bit of it to you. The great majority of WADA's executive committee decided to reinstate RUSADA as compliant, but with strict conditions, and goes on to say the decision provides a clear time frame for RUSADA to meet a number of those conditions, including admittance to the Moscow laboratory. This was one of the key sticking points. What the statement does not talk about is what exactly Russia agreed to. This really came down to a red line that the Putin government had drawn. Under no conditions were they prepared to say or acknowledge the specific findings of Richard McLaren's report into the cheating that went on in Sochi in 2014. You'll remember his report was absolutely scathing. It blamed members of Russia's Ministry of Defense, its secret police, and other bureaucrats for a very sophisticated scheme involving drilling holes in the walls of doping laboratories, passing dirty samples through those holes where they were switched. Clean samples were sent back, and athletes were given different concoctions to help their stamina, help them be more competitive. Well, Russia has always argued, yeah, there were a few bad apples, a few people who may have done it, but not state sponsorship. They seem to have been able to get around that, and this is where WADA is getting the criticism by making them agree to a much less scathing admission of guilt, shall we say, simply that ministry officials were involved in this. So no acknowledgement by Russia that this was state-sponsored, and that was the key to getting them back in.
And some initial reaction coming in, Chris, literally as if you've been beginning to report to us live this morning from the Director General of RUSADA saying that there still needs to be a lot of work done by the Russian anti-doping agency. So obviously, as you suggest, toward that compliance and allowing in the officials to take a look at that Moscow lab, but also saying that this is a positive sign for Russia's athletes, particularly the suspended track and field athletes, weightlifters, and Paralympians. This is exactly, as you say, what the Russian sporting community was hoping for.
It is, and you know, this may seem fairly cut and dry in the West about what happened and who was to blame for this, but here in Russia, it's been seen very differently. This is seen as a gang up on Russia, especially by athletes, facilitated by various government officials. They looked at Professor Richard McLaren's report. They said, aha, you know, a Canadian, and there were Americans and British, and this is clearly a plot, the argument went, to keep the best athletes in the world, some of them anyways, out of the competitions, to tilt the playing field to make it easier for other people to win. So it's never been accepted here, as it has in other parts of the world, exactly what went on or why this punishment was necessary. So today, I very much doubt the feeling is going to be one of relief, but more one of, aha, this was putting things back to the way they should have been in the first place.
Chris, thank you very much. Starting things there with Chris Brown as we get the breaking news that WADA, its executive committee, has voted to reinstate Russia and RUSADA, the Russian anti-doping agency, by a vote 9-2 with 1 abstention. So it was a strong vote in support of reinstatement, according to Sir Craig Reedy, who is the head of WADA. But as I bring in Signa, it's really interesting, and we're going to talk to Becky Scott, and we'll be having a lot of coverage of this, because WADA was very firm when this happened nearly 3 years ago. It had a roadmap. You had to admit, Russia had to admit, that there were systematic manipulation of the system, as found in the McLaren report, had to give access unfettered to this lab where all of this allegedly took place, and it didn't do that. So now today in the report, what we're getting a little bit more from what WADA said is there were failings. Oh, there were failings. So if you give us access within the next 6 months, at some point, undetermined, this is the figure that we're now learning, 6 months to get into that lab, we're going to bring you back. And a lot of people will just say this is politics and this is money at play.
And one of the biggest nations in sport. I mean, let's face it, they've had many successes throughout their career, whether it was the former USSR or now as Russia, and even Olympic athletes from Russia. That's how they competed in 2018 under the Olympic flag. But this really, I think, the essence of what athletes around the globe are saying, and those anti-doping agencies that have been compliant under WADA's rules, is that, you know what, this is a different playing field for Russia. Why has the stance softened? And a little bit, and we kind of saw the writing on the wall, and you mentioned talking to Becky Scott later. We did know she resigned from the Compliance Review Committee. That was kind of the writing on the wall that this indeed would happen. And the athletes in general, and I know that this decision was kind of coming down as you were speaking with Inaki Gomez last hour, but interesting what he said and what it will mean to the athletes, if we can have a listen to what he said.
The last couple of days or weeks or so has been an interesting opportunity for us athletes. You know, you've seen a sort of a mobilization of athletes speaking out and, you know, statements here and calling out, you know, the leaders to listen to us. We are the stakeholders. We are the reason the sporting world exists. And, you know, they have to listen to us eventually. If WADA is not going to be the place where they get, you know, results, go to your own federation and ask for change.
And his federation, the International Athletics Federation, has been quite strong in their position, as has the International Paralympic Committee. But they need more than that. And right now, people questioning about whether sports leadership at WADA is strong enough. Will they, in the future, have an independent drug organization, anti-doping agency, which is what WADA was supposed to stand for, and maybe calling on athletes around the world to really step up their game. After all, these are the athletes that have had moments stolen in their careers. Becky Scott knows what that feels like in their biggest moment, and they want a level playing field. And can they have it when a decision like this was handed down today?
You know, some sports writers are already saying that this is the gravest crisis in WADA's 19-year history because it's gone ahead with this reinstatement despite athletes, despite various countries' anti-doping agencies saying this is unwise, this is premature, Russia hasn't proven itself. We will see, as you say. Lots of questions about it. Some very important reaction for you now. Becky Scott, Olympic champion, heads WADA's Athletes Committee. She was also part of the Compliance Review Committee until she stepped down for that with this decision pending. She's in the Seychelles this morning and joins me now live. Becky, are you hearing me okay?
I can hear you, Heather.
I can hear you well, too, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing you right now. Generally, your reaction overall to WADA's decision to reinstate.
Well, I guess I would start by saying I'm profoundly disappointed. I feel that this was an opportunity for WADA as the global body responsible for regulating doping in sport and responsible for the rights of clean athletes has really dealt a devastating blow to clean athletes with this decision, and I'm quite dismayed with the way things went today, I have to say.
We're getting reaction statements. You know Dr. Rodchenkov, the whistleblower who led us to this story, who's now in the U.S. in hiding, essentially. His lawyer said that he describes it as the greatest treachery against clean athletes in Olympic history. Would you characterize it in that dramatic, in that extreme language?
I think I don't think he's exaggerating, quite honestly. I think we have not seen the kind of response from athletes that we did leading into this decision. We had statements from athletes from Germany, from the UK, from Canada, from the US, Holland, and a number of international federations all rising up and speaking out with the same message, loud and clear, that they feel that signatories to the code should be held to the same standard as athletes. And this is clearly a breach of that. Politics have trumped principle, and this is a very tough day for sport, I would say.
Politics have trumped principle. That's a very important thing that you say, because they've gone ahead, as you say, despite the pleas from athletes, despite the pleas from other countries' anti-doping agencies, and the advice from all of those sectors, and gone ahead with the reinstatement. Is that the why, do you think, Becky, the politics at play here?
I part of it. I think the other was the fact that this is a conditional reinstatement, and it's a reinstatement based on a series of conditions, basically completing the roadmap and getting access to the laboratory in Moscow with the LIMS data and then the samples. So it's put a time deadline on that process now, with the obvious consequence being a redeclaration of non-compliance if it's not fulfilled. I think the members around the table believe that that is an effective way and means to get access to the Moscow laboratory. But what they've done really is reverse the roadmap. They've declared compliance before the conditions have been filled, when it was clear all along that the conditions had to be filled before compliance was declared.
What do you think the consequences of WADA's decision will be?
I think this is a massive blow to the credibility of the organization. And athletes, as I said, have been speaking up. They have been very vocal. They have been sharing their messages globally about how they feel about this. And effectively, the athletes did not get a vote today, and the athletes were clearly not heard. And for an organization whose constituents are athletes, and who set the policies and the rules and regulations by which athletes must comply, this is very disappointing.
You head the athletes committee. You were on the compliance review committee until you stepped down from that. Explain why you did that, Becky.
I did that because I knew that they had decided to recommend a reinstatement of RUSADA based on these conditions, and that it was going to become a commitment to fulfill the conditions rather than actually having filled the conditions before becoming declared compliant. I knew that the athletes of the world would not stand for that it was really a roundabout way of, I felt it was a roundabout way of getting compliance asserted, and I felt that I had to stand with the global majority of clean athletes and reject the recommendation.
Can you now then continue to serve as head of the athletes committee? Can you continue to be any part of this WADA?
That's a good question there, but the answer is yes. I think the committee, the WADA Athletes Committee, has probably been more galvanized and mobilized than ever before over this particular decision. And in fact, you know, at one point did discuss the option of resigning, but have concluded that we have a really important role to play in the sporting landscape, and we're not going to give up now.
Perhaps your leadership and your voice even more important than ever, and it's already been such a leading voice. I just have to let you go. There's so much more reaction to this to get today. But going back to that statement from Dr. Rodchenkov, from his lawyer, talking about how countries should respond, asking that the United States, for example, Becky, USADA, stop funding WADA. It's saying it's wasting its money by funding WADA. And there are people talking about WADA now facing the gravest crisis in its 19-year history. The answers to these questions we will not get to because we've just lost Becky Scott. I have to just tell you, she's there live in the Seychelles Islands, so understandably communications not as solid as we might hope. The breaking news coming out of the Seychelles Islands that WADA's executive committee has voted very strongly by a vote of 9-2 to reinstate Russia's anti-doping agency, RUSADA, to allow it back into the game, despite the fact that Russia has not met two key conditions that had been set out by WADA before it was supposed to allow Russia back in. Those conditions go right back to the explosive report that we've been talking about for years now, commissioned by the IOC, carried out by the independent investigator, Richard McLaren, the London, Ontario lawyer and member of CAS, who's on the phone with me from Heathrow Airport, so we'll hopefully have a good connection, about to catch a flight. But Professor McLaren, good morning to you there in Heathrow. I was just laying out the results of the vote, 9-2 to reinstate Russia with the conditions that there'd be 6 months to get into the lab in Russia, but basically they've ignored their own conditions for Russia's reinstatement, and I'm wondering your overall reaction, number one.
Well, I think what's happened is, in the course of agreeing to the correspondence coming from the Ministry of Sport in Russia, is they've given up any leverage and control. Russia has dictated the terms on which they can be reinstated, and then it'll be a question of whether or not they observe the promises that are in the exchange of correspondence of last week.
You know, it's interesting, some of the initial reaction from sports writers and even from Becky Scott, whom you know well, is that this is not Russia complying with WADA. This is WADA acquiescing to Russia. This is politics trumping principle, is how Becky Scott put it. How do you see it?
Well, I think that's a reasonable statement in the circumstances. I think WADA found themselves in a very difficult circumstance where they decided that the practicalities of the situation should lead them in the direction that they've gone. But in the course of doing so, they've given up any hold on being able to make Russia comply, and the experience of the independent commission that I was on and the previous one before with Richard Pound and Gunther Junger, our suspicion would be that there's very little likelihood that they will observe the obligations that they put in that letter.
So, little likelihood they will change their ways or as you say, follow what was set out in terms of what required of them. The specific points that Russia was supposed to follow directly flowed from you. For example, they were supposed to admit publicly that there had been the systematic manipulation that you found, and they were supposed to allow access to the Russian labs in which you found so much wrongdoing, the sample swapping, etc. The fact that those two conditions which you laid out, those two issues which you laid out, are not going to be met, how important is that?
Well, I think it's always going to be difficult to ever have them admit fully that this system existed. So the first condition is perhaps of lesser importance than getting the data, but the promises there are not by the Ministry of Sport that the data will be given, but if the ministry agrees and if the investigation committee, which is controlled by the Kremlin, is prepared to give up access, and then the expert would have to determine that there's problems with the data, and after that they get sampled. So there's a lot of different opportunities for the Russian side to back out of the arrangement.
Some of the initial reaction we're hearing from agencies like the United States Anti-Doping Agency, from various athletes, they essentially say that WADA has ignored the outcry. And they are talking about this being perhaps the greatest crisis facing WADA in its history. What do you think the consequences of this decision will be?
Well, I'm surprised that the executive committee makes this decision without reference to the full foundation board meeting, which is coming up in November, so it's not that far away, so that everybody could participate in the decision, because now the decision's made by a much smaller group. And it could be a watershed point for WADA, for sure. We'll see what the reaction is around the world. It's already swelling on the athlete side, very unfavorably towards what's been done.
Okay. I'll leave it at that because want to hear you clearly, and I'm having a little bit of noise in the background on the phone, but I certainly think we got very much the essence of your comments, and they're important to get. Richard McLaren, thank you very much, the author of the McLaren Report that highlighted so clearly the allegations of systematic manipulation, state-sponsored and state-directed doping in Russia.